Hi, I'm Ellen from the Chili Dog. I'm about to start a pair of my spindler socks. These socks are worked from the toe up and begin with a square toe. If we look closer at the toe shaping, you may be thinking there is nothing about that toe that looks square, but looks can be deceiving. Unlike most sock toes, the beginning stitches of a square toe aren't cast on horizontally across the tip of the toe. Instead, 4 stitches are cast on vertically, and then you work a small rectangle by knitting back and forth in rows, and finally you pick up stitches all around the edges of the rectangle to square things out and begin working your sock in the round. Once you've finished the shaping increases, you've created what appears to be this continuous band around the tip of the toe. It's pretty slick. So today I'm going to show you how to actually knit a square toe. First, I'm going to give a detailed demonstration explaining all the hows and whys using DPNs, because it's going to be a lot easier to see how things work around the rectangle when there's a separate needle for each side. Then, since many knitters prefer using long circular needles to knit socks, I'll share an abbreviated demonstration on a single circular needle without any DPNs at all. Let's get started. To cast on a square sock toe, you need 2 needles and should use a double-sided cast-on method. I'll be using Judy's Magic cast-on, but you could also use a Turkish cast-on or a figure-8 cast-on or even some sort of provisional cast-on. None of these methods necessarily works better than the other. They're just different ways to accomplish the same result. No matter what size sock you're knitting or what weight yarn you're using, a square toe begins by casting on 4 double-sided stitches. So I'm going to use Judy's Magic cast on, and just a refresher, you begin by weaving the tail of your yarn over under the fingers on your left hand. Your yarn is held kind of in the slingshot position. Hold your 2 needles together and then bring the front yarn between the needles and back over the back needle. Then bring the back yarn forward and over the front needle. Front yarn between the needles and over the back needle. And then the back yarn comes forward and over the front needle. And I'm going to continue like that until I have 4 stitches on each needle. Now I'm going to work across the 4 stitches that are here on my front yellow needle, while those 4 stitches that are on my back red needle are just going to be held in place. You could choose to put these stitches onto a stitch holder or a piece of waste yarn to keep them out of the way, but since I'm only going to be knitting a few rows, it's often just as easy to be careful and just leave these stitches held on the DPN. So to start knitting across this yellow needle, I need to rotate things so that I have my needle points pointing towards the left, or pointing towards the right rather. I'm going to slide my stitches that are on the red needle down to the center of the needle just so that they're less likely to fall off the tips. And then I'm going to work 8 rows of stitches in stockinette stitch, which just means I'm going to knit on the right side and purl on the wrong side. How many rows you need to knit are going to be dependent on both the size of the sock that you're making and also on the weight of the yarn that you're using. So you'll need to refer to your pattern. So I'm just going to knit back and forth in rows here, 8 rows in stockinette stitch. So when I get to the end of that first row, I'm going to carefully turn things so that I can continue working my purl stitches back the other direction. Now that my rectangle is complete, it's time to begin working in rounds. I'm going to turn my work over, so I'm looking at the right side, and then I'm going to knit 2 stitches. And for the spindler sock pattern that I'm knitting, this is going to be the beginning of the round. So I'm going to place a stitch marker here on my needle to remind myself of that. So now I'm going to knit to the end of the row, and then I'll need to pick up and knit 6 stitches along the side, and that is related to how many rows that I worked. So you'll need to refer to your pattern as to how many stitches you need to pick up along the side. As you're picking up those stitches along the side of the rectangle, here's a couple things to think about. First, you may be wondering why we're going to pick up less stitches than there are rows. We have to remember that knit stitches aren't square. They're wider than they are tall. So when we're working across a distance, there will be less stitches across this distance than there would be rows. To create that continuous looking band around the toe, we want to remember as we're picking up our stitches that we don't want to be picking up through the center of these edge stitches. We want to make sure that we're really getting here into this very side edge as we're picking up stitches. So we're only going to be picking up through this very edge leg. Now, technically, you can use just your right hand needle to pick up and knit stitches along an edge like this. However, it can be easier to see what you're doing and to manipulate things if you use a needle in each hand. So I'm going to leave these 4 stitches on one double pointed needle, and then we're going to put all of our picked up stitches onto a separate double pointed needle. So again, I'm looking just at the edge. I won't have a stitch picked up in every edge stitch. So I'm just going to kind of estimate things of where things should go here. So I'm going to insert my left needle from the front to the back under just that very edge loop. And then I'm going to knit that picked up stitch. So again, I'll insert my left needle from the front to the back right under one of those edge legs, and then knit the stitch. And sometimes this is called just picking up stitches. Sometimes you'll see it written as pick up and knit. It's kind of depends on the designer that wrote the pattern. Now that I have picked up my stitches along one side of the rectangle, I'm going to rotate things, and then I'm going to work across this short side of my rectangle. And these are the opposite side of the original stitches that I cast on at the beginning. So as I'm working across these 4 stitches, when I get to the center of the 4 stitches, I am actually going to take a second and place a second stitch marker. And the purpose of that is because it marks the other side of my sock. Because when I get done with this first pickup round, I'm actually going to rearrange my stitches so everything is evenly divided in the next round, so I can continue on my double pointed needles with the same number of stitches on every needle. So I finished working across those 4 stitches. I'm going to rotate, and then to finish things up in this first round, I need to pick up stitches along the other edge of the rectangle. And just like before, I want to be careful that I'm not picking up stitches between the columns of stitches. I want to make sure that I'm picking up along these very edge legs on the rectangle. And just like before, I'm going to use 2 needles to do that. Make sure your yarn tail is out of the way here because it can make things a little bit trickier. And you can see here, double points can be a little bit, especially on camera, they can be a little bit fidgety. So I'm going to begin picking up my stitches along the edge, and just make sure that you're picking up just as many on the second edge as you did on the first edge. After you finish picking up those stitches on the other side of the rectangle, you would just need to work 2 stitches to get back to the beginning of the round. So once this square is complete and you've picked up all your stitches, you continue in rounds for the rest of your toe, increasing 2 stitches on each side of the sock every other round until you reach your desired sock circumference. As I begin my toe shaping, I'm going to start with a knit round, and as I'm knitting all of the stitches in this next round, I'm going to divide things out on my double pointed needles a little bit more evenly so I have the same number of stitches on every needle. And I'll leave the beginning of round marker there for now until I get back to it at the end so I can divide things out. So since I have 20 stitches around my needles right now, I want to end up with 5 stitches on each needle. I've knit all the way around my stitches and I'm back to that beginning of round stitch marker. And as I worked, I divided my sock stitches evenly onto each of the 4 needles. Now I can use my needles to show me where the beginning of the round is, and I don't really need this stitch marker anymore. So the stitches that are on these first 2 needles are the stitches that are the instep across the top of my sock foot. The stitches on the second 2 needles are the sole on the bottom of my foot. Since I completed 1 round without any increases, now I need to do an increase round. So for every increase round, you knit a stitch, make an increase, knit to 1 stitch before the end of the instep, make another increase, and then knit. And then you do the same thing across the sole stitches. You knit, increase, knit to 1 stitch before the end of the sole, increase, and then knit that final stitch. And your sock pattern should indicate what type of increase you will use at those increase points. Then you would continue alternating and work a knit round followed by an increase round until you have the desired number of stitches around the circumference of your sock. Now that you've seen the entire construction process for a square toe in great detail, let's take a broader approach, and I'll show you how to create a square toe without DPNs using a long circular needle and the magic loop method. And this time around, we're going to be focusing more on needle management and how this long circular needle moves through your stitches. Just like before, we're going to start with Judy's Magic Cast On and cast on our 8 stitches onto our 2 knitting needles. So 4 stitches on each needle. And again, any double-sided cast on will work. I just like to use Judy's Magic Cast On. So once all of our stitches are cast on, 4 of our stitches are going to be held and 4 of our stitches are going to be worked back and forth in rows. So to begin working in rows, I need to rotate my needles the other direction. And then I'm going to work the rectangle back and forth across these top 4 stitches, and the bottom 4 stitches are going to be held on my cord. So to do that, I'm going to be pulling that needle through the stitches, and now those stitches are held on my cord, and I can go ahead and knit my rectangle back and forth in rows across the other 4 stitches. So I'm starting with a right side row. I'll knit my 4 stitches. And when I get to the end of the row, I need to turn things over so that the wrong side is facing me. I don't need to do any repositioning of my stitches because those 4 stitches are still held on the cord and my working stitches are up at the needle tip. So now I can continue working back and forth in rows like that and create my rectangle. I finished knitting my rectangle back and forth in rows, and I ended with a wrong side row. Now I need to turn things over so that I can begin working in rounds again. So the right side is facing me. I'm going to knit the first 2 stitches that are along that short side of the rectangle. And you may recall that last time I put a stitch marker here in between the first and last 2 stitches on the short side that indicated the side of my sock toe. This time, however, I'm going to skip the stitch marker because I can get things set up as I'm knitting the first round so that my instep stitches are on one side of my needles and my sole stitches are on the other side of my needles, just like we're used to when we knit magic loop. So instead of placing a marker there, I'm going to go ahead and pull that right hand needle through. So now I'm just going to focus on getting the instep stitches onto this knitting needle. So my first 2 stitches belong to the instep. And then I'll pick up my stitches along the long side of the rectangle because they also belong to the instep. And I can either use the left hand needle here to give me a little assist as I'm picking up those stitches along the very edge, or I could just use my right hand needle, whichever works easiest for you. After you've picked up your stitches along the first long edge of the rectangle, you need to work the next short edge, and there are those 4 stitches on the short edge. But right now my needle is not in a place that I can knit. I need 2 of those stitches to be my instep and 2 to be the sole. So what I like to do is divide those stitches in half, 2 and 2, pinch my cord, and pull it through between those stitches. Slide my needle tip in until I can get my stitches ready to work, and then I can knit those last 2 instep stitches. So at this point, all of my instep stitches are on my right hand needle. I'll rotate things. So now we can focus just on our sole stitches. So that back needle needs to come through so that we're ready to work our sole stitches. And the front needle needs to come out so we can use it to work with. And now all of these instep stitches are held on the cord. So I'm going to knit the first 2 sole stitches, Then I'll pick up my stitches along the long edge of the rectangle. Then once you've finished picking up your stitches, you work those final 2 stitches from the short end of the rectangle. And now you're all set up to continue in magic loop. These stitches are your sole stitches. The stitches that are currently on the cord are your instep stitches. Rotate your work. The held stitches slide down to the needle tip so that you can work them. And then the stitches that you just completed, you slide the needle out and they become the stitches that are now held on the cord. And then you can continue increasing your toe just like I showed before, where you work 1 round even with no increases, and then 1 round where you increase a stitch on each side of the instep and then increase a stitch on each side of the sole. I hope you enjoyed learning how to create a square sock toe. If you did, make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your knitting friends. If you'd like to try this technique in a pattern, head over to the shop section of thechillydog.com and look for my spindler socks pattern. Until we stitch again, happy knitting!